Apple is one of the biggest companies in the world, and they release thousands upon thousands of devices every year. Nowadays, technology isn't long-lasting, and people replace their phones with any new release from their favorite brand as soon as they can. This leaves the world with a huge problem, and this will eventually have a huge array of consequences. Digital waste is a huge problem, but many companies try to fight against it with huge efforts and new policies. This includes Apple, and we will tell you how they get it done. The number of active Apple users has increased, and now you can say that 4 out of 10 mobile users use an iPhone. Apple originally released a new phone every few years, and their customers changed their phones, disposing of hundreds of devices every few years. The users reached 1 billion, and by 2013, the problem was very serious, and they needed to actually change their politics if they wanted to, well, keep our world from total annihilation. There were a lot of early politics behind the recycling model that they use now. For example, in their early days, they allowed customers to give the company their old phones. If you happen to have an older version of the newer model, you could give it to an employee in the same store, and they will give you a discount that you could use to get your brand new model. The clients could do this only if their phones were in good condition and still worked as well as before. All of those old phones went to refurbishing warehouses. From this point onward, they would be repaired or checked and sold to emerging markets like India. Now, this isn't a new fight, and electronics disposal isn't very old in reality. This has been happening since the 1970s, and we will explore a bit more of it. All of our electronics are made with a lot of components that are very toxic, valuable, or completely harmless. Now, toxic waste is probably the most dangerous, and the one that is worse for the environment. A lot of electronics are composed of toxic substances and heavy metals, like mercury, cadmium, lead, and more. Most companies, including Apple, used to just throw everything away in landfills. A lot of companies do this, and many people think this isn't as bad as it seems. But the reality is that this is one of the biggest problems environmentalists face. Naturally, heavy metals don't just return to the earth and call it a day. They need hundreds upon thousands of years to actually be recycled, and they can be very toxic after they've been refined. This is why in numerous countries, landfills are forbidden, and why in so many countries, this is still happening. This is the cheapest way to actually dispose of these materials, but Apple's initiatives show that there are alternatives too. As we mentioned before, Apple refurbished most of their old devices so they could resell them again in other markets. This isn't the most ethical, and most customers wouldn't be happy, but the environment really appreciates this cost reduction. Just so you know, this isn't as bad. They only refurbish phones that are in the best shape, with little to no defects or problems. If a phone is in very rough shape, they just recycle the components. As we explained, there are 2 phases for the recycling program Apple has. One where they recover and repurpose the phone components, and another where they actually reuse the phones, bringing them to an optimal state before reselling them. Let's dig into the first part of their program and talk about lithium, an Apple R&D project focused on new disassembly technology. In case you don't know, phones have precious metals inside of them, along with toxic materials and heavy metals. Daisy, a robot, can recover all of it without much trouble. Daisy can extract most of the gold, platinum, copper, glass, chromium, and more from the phones without risking any employees. According to Apple, they can work around their main logic boards and the batteries, but don't disclose what they do with a lot of these components and their cameras, for example, without further damaging the components. This allows the company to reuse almost anything. One of Apple's recycling partners is Brightstar, and according to them, they distribute the products, leading to buybacks and trade. Right now, they recycle up to 10 million devices each year, and they distribute the components to more than 30 countries. Their recycling efforts also help them get more components they can use to repair faulty phones, either for refurbishing or for their clients. Those old components are saved in their warehouse for further repairs, and any toxic material is sent to a specialist facility plant in China that will later repurpose those heavy metals. By recollecting old, discontinued products, they can reuse their components for other clients that don't want any upgrades. For example, if you bring in an iPad 2, an iPhone 4, or maybe an old Mac from 2007, you could get a juicy discount in any Apple store. If their condition is optimal, you could get gift cards too. With this, they've collected over 40,000 tons of e-waste that will be further salvaged by them. The environmental impact that e-waste has on the world is huge, and more companies should actually create recycling policies. The toxic materials and waste in underdeveloped countries are a tremendous problem and mostly illegal. This contributes to the water sourcing problem worldwide and contributes to the development of sickness in vulnerable populations. Apple actually helps a lot by recovering those cell phones and reselling them, giving them a longer life and a greater purpose. Also, they minimize their need for raw materials, saving money and resources while helping the world. This commitment to sustainability helps the world a lot in other areas too. For example, Apple is a pioneer in creating a closed supply chain where they can use their own products to actually create new products. If companies started doing this, soon they would save a lot of money in resources while delivering products with the same high quality, with little to no outsourcing, reducing their costs even further. This form of circular economy is a lifesaver if your resources are as limited as electrical parts are nowadays. After explaining how Apple's recycling policies are one of the best, we will now talk about the problems behind their sales model. We mentioned that every year Apple releases new, better models that have huge improvements. This is something amazing for Apple fans, but for the rest of the world, not so much. Each time Apple changes the core of their cell phones, the disassembly process changes, the components change, and recycling the phones becomes more and more difficult over time. Those unique components that once were an innovation can later become a huge problem. This is one of the biggest problems Apple faces as a company right now, their old phones. After refurbishing them, a lot of people will still buy them, but most likely the vast majority will be stored away. This is still e-waste, and thousands of those phones will be disposed of. Apple is trying to refine its recycling methods to actually recover components from these phones and reuse them in a much more profitable and sustainable way. Now, as you might imagine, Apple can't collect every single product in the world and reuse it. Most of Apple's products stay in the hands of someone who disposes of them in their own way, and they end up in a landfill somewhere in the world. What we're trying to say with this is that before thinking about recycling policies that a company develops, we need to change our own behavior and how we dispose of our gadgets. If possible, try to give back your Apple device to the company, or find a way to actually reuse it if it can still be reused. Huge tech companies are trying to reduce their environmental impact around the world. Apple is one of the pioneers in this cycle economy model, and you could be part of the solution with little to no effort.